I've done solo hikes for years. I like the quiet, the challenge, and the isolation. Nothing ever really scared me out there. Not the wildlife, not the dark, not even being alone. But last fall, something changed. Something happened that made me think twice about heading out again, especially alone. It started when I decided to explore a stretch of wilderness up north in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. I'd found an old map online that showed an unmaintained trail, Ridge Trail, that curved around a deep valley and eventually led to an old fire tower that hadn't been in use for decades. It wasn't on any official hiking websites, and most people didn't even seem to know it existed anymore. That was exactly what drew me to it. I planned a 4-day loop, hike in from the east, follow the Ridge Trail for a couple of days, hit the tower, then cut southwest to connect with a more popular trail and hike back out. I packed for bad weather, extra food, brought my GPS, topo maps, compass, first aid kit, all the basics. I let my brother know where I was going and when I expected to be back. I was careful, always have been. The first day was uneventful. I parked at a small trailhead just outside a town called Rexton and started hiking around noon. The air was crisp, sky mostly clear, just a few clouds moving in from the west. The trail was faint but visible at first. Some old blazes on trees, the occasional boot print. The terrain wasn't too rough, mostly gentle climbs and thick woods. Just birds, chipmunks, the occasional squirrel. Peaceful. I set up camp near a small creek that evening. It got colder than I expected, maybe low 30s, and I had to dig into my extra layers. I made some freeze-dried pasta, read a bit, and climbed into my sleeping bag. No strange noises that night, just the wind in the trees. The next morning, I packed up and followed the trail further west. It started getting fainter by mid-morning. Fewer blazes. Sometimes I had to stop, check the map, and backtrack. The ground was thick with leaves, and it had rained recently, so things were soft and a bit muddy in places. I crossed a dried-up stream bed around noon and climbed a long ridge that seemed to go on forever. The trees were tall and dense, mostly pine and old birch. No undergrowth, just soft needles and moss. That afternoon, I found what I think was the real Ridge Trail. It hugged the side of a steep hill, with the land dropping off sharply to my right into a wooded valley. There were no signs of human traffic anymore, no footprints, no broken branches, nothing. Just me, the trees, and the sound of wind picking up. I made camp on a flat shelf off the trail around 5 p.m. It looked like someone might have used it years ago. There were stones in a rough fire ring, long and used. I didn't bother with a fire. The wind had picked up more, and the temperature was dropping again. I sat in my tent with my headlamp and studied the map, trying to pinpoint where I was. That's when I noticed something strange. The map showed the fire tower should be about a day's hike west of where I was, but when I zoomed in on my GPS and compared it to the topo, things didn't quite match. The trail on the map curved north around a hill, but what I had walked followed the ridge almost directly west. I figured maybe the trail had shifted over time or the map was outdated. It was easy to make mistakes out here, especially with unofficial trails. I didn't sleep well that night. The wind never let up, and I kept hearing what sounded like movement in the trees. Branches snapping, underbrush rustling. I told myself it was just animals, but I kept waking up, feeling like something was off. I didn't unzip the tent. I just waited for the sun to rise. When it did, I packed up and moved fast. I kept following the ridge, still no sign of other people, not even distant planes overhead. By noon, I should have reached the fire tower or at least seen signs of it. But there was nothing, just more trees, more ridge, more silence. That afternoon, I ran into my first real problem. The trail disappeared. It just stopped. 1 minute I was walking along a faint but visible path. The next I was standing in a patch of thick forest with no trail in any direction. I walked forward, thinking maybe I'd lost it in the leaves, but after 30 minutes of circling, I had to accept I'd lost the trail completely. I pulled out my GPS. Still had battery. The screen showed my location, but the map data didn't have enough detail to help. I tried to backtrack, but somehow I'd veered off more than I thought. Nothing looked familiar. I started to get that tight feeling in my chest, the beginning of panic. I took a break, forced myself to eat a granola bar and drink some water. I told myself I'd hiked off-trail before. I could handle this. I still had 3 days of food, clean water, and time. I just had to get my bearings. But as the afternoon wore on, the forest got denser. The trees blocked out more of the sky. Everything started looking the same: pale trunks, green moss, brown ground. No signs of animals, no scat, no tracks, no birdsong. Just silence. I picked a direction, southwest, toward where the main trail should have been, and started moving steadily. But the terrain worked against me. Hills got steeper, rocks slick from moss. I slipped more than once and had to slow down. As it got darker, I realized I had to camp again without really knowing where I was. That night was worse than the last. I heard something around midnight, a distinct snapping sound, not far off. Then another. I turned off my headlamp and just lay there, trying to listen. The wind was calmer, but something was definitely moving out there. At one point, I thought I heard breathing, just a low, slow rhythm somewhere beyond the tent wall. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When daylight came, I packed quickly and moved on, keeping my knife in my hand, stupid as that probably looked. I wasn't sure what I was even afraid of. A bear? Maybe, but it didn't feel like a bear. It felt like someone was following me. The next 2 days blurred together. I was off any trail now, just moving through thick forest, trying to follow my compass and GPS toward a road I knew should exist somewhere south of the ridge. But things got weirder. On the third morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. There was a set of footprints in the soft dirt near a stream. Not mine. I checked. Different tread pattern, larger boot size, going the opposite direction from where I came. I called out instinctively, but no answer came. Not that I expected one. Still, it meant someone else was out here. That should have been comforting. But it wasn't. Later that day, I found a crude shelter. Just a lean-to made of branches, covered in pine boughs. It looked fresh. No gear inside. No signs of life. Just the faint smell of smoke, like someone had been there not long ago. I didn't linger. I didn't want to meet whoever had made that shelter. By that point, I was running low on food, down to protein bars and jerky. I rationed water, only drinking when I absolutely had to. I moved constantly, resting only when I felt like I couldn't go on. That final night was the worst. I camped near a boulder field, hoping the open space would help me hear anything approaching. I slept for maybe 2 hours, then woke to the distinct sound of footsteps on stone. Not animal sounds, boots on rock, slow, careful steps. I didn't move. I just lay there in the darkness, holding my breath. The steps came closer, then stopped. I didn't hear anything after that. I waited until daylight before unzipping the tent. No one was there. No prints, no signs, just rocks and trees. I didn't eat that morning, just drank the last of my water and pushed on. It took me until late afternoon, but I finally found the road. It wasn't the road I had parked near. This one was older, barely a gravel strip, but it was something. I followed it until I found a small hunting cabin, empty but unlocked. I collapsed on the porch and stayed there until a truck rolled by at dusk. The guy driving it was an older man heading to his own camp for the weekend. When he saw me, dirty, exhausted, and hollow-eyed, he didn't ask many questions. He just gave me water, let me sit in the passenger seat, and drove me into town. I never went back to look for the trail. I never found out who made that shelter or whose footsteps I heard. All I know is something was out there with me. Not a ghost or a monster, just a person or people. Someone living off-grid, maybe, or maybe someone who didn't want company. Either way, I was in their territory and they let me know it. I still hike, still camp, but never alone. And never in that part of the woods again. Somewhere out there, beyond the marked trails and the satellite coverage, there are places where people live without being seen. And if you stumble across them, you better hope they let you leave. I've been backpacking for years. I've done week-long trips through the Rockies, the Cascades, parts of the Appalachian Trail. I don't go for the Instagram-type experiences. I don't care about taking photos or checking out famous landmarks. I like being off the grid, alone, disconnected, Not for any deep reason, I just prefer the quiet. The routine of walking, setting up camp, eating and sleeping. Something about it resets me. But what happened last spring changed how I look at the woods forever. It started as a solo trip through a stretch of forest in northern Idaho. I won't name the exact area, but it wasn't in a national park or anywhere popular. Just a patch of BLM land I'd mapped out on satellite images and topographic maps. I planned to be out there for 6 days. No cell service, no marked trails, just logging roads and game paths. I had a Garmin for emergencies, extra batteries, and a laminated map I'd made myself. I wasn't being careless. I'm not one of those guys who gets lost because they wander off with a bottle of water and no gear. I had everything planned down to the hour. The first 2 days were peaceful. I didn't see another person or even any signs of people. No rappers, no fire rings, no tree carvings. Just old pines, quiet streams, and the occasional deer. I hiked about 10 miles a day, stopping mid-afternoon to set up camp and gather firewood. On the third day, I took a detour from my original route. It wasn't spontaneous. I'd seen a ravine on the map that looked interesting, a narrow cut in the forest that dropped sharply and followed a creek. I wanted to check it out, maybe camp near the bottom. Getting into the ravine took longer than I thought. The terrain was rough, lots of loose rock and thick undergrowth. But once I got down there, it was worth it. The creek was crystal clear, rushing over smooth stones and downed logs. The walls of the ravine rose maybe 60 feet on both sides, covered in moss and ferns. It was quiet, cooler than the forest above, and sheltered from the wind. I set up camp a little ways from the creek, on a flat patch of ground surrounded by tall brush. I cooked dinner, listened to the water for a while, then turned in early. That night, I woke up at some point. I don't know what time it was, but it was pitch black. No moonlight, no sound but the creek. I didn't know why I woke up. No animal sounds, no wind, just a feeling. I laid still for a long time, ears straining for anything, but nothing happened. Eventually, I fell back asleep. In the morning, something felt off. Took me a while to figure it out. The first thing I noticed was that some of my gear had shifted. Not stolen or tampered with, just moved slightly. My cooking pot was a few feet from where I'd left it. My small folding shovel was sticking into the ground instead of lying on my pack. I told myself I probably bumped them in the dark or placed them differently and forgot, but it still felt wrong. I decided not to stay another night in the ravine. I packed up and climbed out, which took longer than I remembered coming down. My legs were already tired, and the dirt was dry and loose. I slipped once and scraped my hand bad enough to bleed. When I got to the top, I headed northeast, away from the ravine and back toward higher ground. I figured I'd find a ridge to camp on that night, somewhere more open, where I could see around me. That afternoon, I started noticing faint trails that didn't match anything on my map. They weren't game trails, too wide, too deliberate. But they weren't roads either, just narrow paths, cutting through thick brush in long, curving lines. They weren't maintained, but they looked used. I followed one for a while, thinking maybe it would lead to an old logging camp or something. What I found instead was a clearing, not a natural one. Someone had cleared this space out. Maybe a quarter acre, maybe a little more. The ground was bare dirt, hard-packed with signs of recent use. Old fire pits, metal scraps, a few rusted-out barrels stacked near a tree. No trash, no furniture, no tools, just signs that people had been here. I stood there a long time just looking, trying to decide if I should keep walking or check it out more. That's when I saw the marks in the dirt. They were fresh boot prints, mostly. A lot of them crisscrossing the clearing. All different directions, like people had been moving around, pacing or circling. Some of the prints were big, larger than mine, maybe size 13 or 14. But what bothered me wasn't the size. It was the number. Dozens of prints. Maybe more. And none of them looked more than a day old. Maybe even hours. I slowly backed away, trying not to step on anything. I didn't want to be seen. Didn't want anyone to know I'd found that place. I didn't run, but I moved fast, keeping low, not stopping until I was deep in the trees again. I kept hiking for hours after that, not even bothering to look for a good camp. I just wanted distance. I only stopped when it got too dark to see. I didn't sleep well that night. I didn't set up my tent, just rolled out my pad under a tree and kept my pack close. Every snap of a twig made me sit up. Every gust of wind felt like footsteps. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had seen me, that I wasn't alone out there. The next morning, I changed course. I was supposed to keep heading northeast for another 2 days before looping back, but I decided to cut straight east and get back to the forest road where I'd parked my car. I figured I could hike fast and be back by the next night. Maybe camp one more time if I had to, but the forest didn't cooperate. I don't know if I was rushing or just turned around, but by late afternoon, I realized I wasn't where I thought I was. The terrain didn't match my map, and my compass readings made no sense. I stopped, got out my Garmin, and tried to get a fix. Nothing. The screen froze, then went blank. I changed the batteries. Still nothing. Just a faint buzzing sound and a black screen. That's when I started hearing them. Not voices, just sounds. Branches breaking, leaves rustling. Too heavy for deer or small animals. Too quiet for bears or elk. They came in short bursts. Far off, then closer. Then nothing. Always when I was moving. Never when I stopped. I tried not to panic. I forced myself to sit, drink water, eat a granola bar. I told myself it was just wildlife. Maybe coyotes. Maybe my own footsteps echoing weirdly. But deep down, I knew better. I pushed on, even though I wasn't sure of the direction. I just moved, trying to keep the sun behind me. I started noticing things in the trees. Carvings. Not the usual initials or dates. These were crude shapes. Circles. Excess. A triangle with a line through it. All hacked deep into the bark. Always facing the trail I was on. Like markers. That night, I didn't stop. I kept walking, using my headlamp and spare batteries. The sounds got closer. Sometimes I'd hear 2 branches snap at once, like someone moving quickly in more than one direction. I'd spin around and see nothing, just empty trees and shadows. I finally stopped around 3 a.m. when my feet couldn't take it anymore. I crouched under a thick pine, wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, and kept my knife in my hand. I didn't sleep, just rested with my eyes closed, counting every breath. In the early light of dawn, I moved again. My legs were shaking. I was running on fumes. I didn't know where I was, but the trees were thinning, and I saw more light ahead. Around noon, I found a logging road. It looked old, rutted, and overgrown, but it was something. I followed it, hoping it would lead to a main road or a ranger station. A few miles down, I saw something that made my stomach turn. A truck, parked on the side of the road, covered in branches like someone had tried to hide it. An old green pickup, rusty but running. The driver's side door was open. No one inside. I didn't stop. I didn't even look too long. Just kept walking faster now. My mouth was dry. My heart was pounding. I didn't know if I was being followed or if I'd walked into something worse. A few hours later, I heard an engine. Real this time, not imagined. A four-wheeler came up the road behind me. Some hunter or logger. I waved them down, nearly collapsed in front of them. I didn't say much, just told them I'd gotten turned around and needed a ride back to the highway. They gave me water, a granola bar, and a ride. I didn't tell them about the clearing, the boots, the symbols. I didn't want to sound crazy. I just wanted to get home. When I finally got back to my car, I sat inside for a long time before starting the engine. My hands were still shaking. My pack stank of sweat and fear. I drove for hours, not stopping until I hit a town with a motel. I never went back to that part of Idaho. I never will. I still go hiking, but not solo anymore. Not off-trail. And never near any place that feels too quiet, too still. Because I don't know who was in those woods. But they knew I was there, and they didn't want me to leave. I've always liked being alone in the woods, not just camping with a tent and some buddies, but truly alone. No cell signal, no music, just a backpack, a knife, and the sound of my boots crunching through pine needles. I've done solo backpacking trips every year since I turned 22. I'm 34 now, and over time I learned how to read the forest like a map, how to judge distance by tree spacing, follow animal trails without getting turned around, find water by listening to how wind moves. I always prided myself on my self-reliance. Last fall, I planned a week-long trek through a stretch of national forest in northern Idaho I hadn't explored before. It wasn't even one of the marked areas on most trail apps. I found it by accident while scanning old topographical maps. There was a patch of forestland bordering a steep ravine, dotted with dozens of small creeks and clearings. From the satellite view, I could see that no major trails ran through it. That was perfect for me. I wanted silence. I wanted solitude. I parked my truck at the edge of an unmarked service road just after sunrise. The area was remote. The drive took me nearly 6 hours from the last gas station, and I hadn't passed another car for over 45 minutes. There was no ranger station, no cabins, just a rusted gate that had been yanked halfway off its hinges and some old no trespassing signs nailed to the trees. I ignored them. It was public land, probably leftover warnings from logging companies or old hunting camps. I had everything I needed in my pack: freeze-dried meals, water filtration, extra socks, a compass, map, emergency radio, my Glock, and even a flare gun just in case. I marked my intended path with GPS before I lost signal and left a printed map with my brother, circling the general area I'd be in. I always took that precaution, but I had no plans of getting lost. This wasn't my first trip. The first day was beautiful. I spent it weaving my way through fir trees and thick underbrush. The air smelled like wet bark and distant rain. I made good progress, about 7 miles in by noon, and found a flat stretch near a stream where I could pitch my tent. I set up camp, boiled some water, ate, and fell asleep listening to the wind in the branches. The second day felt even better. I pushed deeper into the trees, going uphill toward where I knew the ridge would be. The terrain changed the higher I climbed. More rocks, thinner trees, and the occasional open spot where the sun broke through the branches. I spotted signs of wildlife: bear scat, claw marks on trees, deer prints near the water's edge, but nothing unusual. No sounds of people, no trash, no footprints. It was just me, and I loved it. It wasn't until the third day that things started to feel off. Not wrong, not dangerous, just slightly wrong in that way where you feel like something isn't how it should be, even if you can't explain it. It started with the silence. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but by mid-morning, I realized I hadn't heard a single bird. No chirps, no wing flutters, nothing. Even squirrels, which usually scramble and chatter when I pass through their territory, were absent. I stopped walking and just stood there, listening. It was completely quiet. The wind was still blowing through the trees, but it sounded dull, like it was passing through thick cotton. I told myself it was just timing. Maybe I'd entered a stretch of woods between active areas. Maybe the animals were hiding, or maybe it was the season. But I'd hiked through these woods in the fall before. There should have been something. The air smelled different too. Not rotten or dangerous, just still. Like a room that hadn't been opened in weeks. I moved on a little slower than before. Every so often, I checked my compass and map. Everything lined up. I was heading northeast, exactly the way I planned. That afternoon, I came across an old fire ring. It was built from blackened rocks stacked in a circle, and inside it were the remains of a small campfire, mostly ash with a few half-burned logs. At first, I was excited. It meant someone had camped here before, which made me feel less isolated. But when I got closer, I saw that the ash wasn't fresh. The logs were damp with dew, covered in that gray fuzz mold gets after sitting too long in wet air. It hadn't been used for weeks, maybe months. Next to the fire ring was a pile of small bones. Rabbit or squirrel, probably. Clean, white, picked bare. That wasn't unusual either. Lots of people cook small game out here, but the arrangement was strange. The bones weren't scattered. They were neatly stacked in a triangle, almost like someone had intentionally lined them up. Could have been some camper's weird habit. I don't know, but I didn't like it. I backed away and kept going. That night I had trouble sleeping. The silence was too thick. I'm used to forest sounds, owls, insects, trees creaking, but it was like everything had gone dead. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the nothing, until sometime after midnight when I finally dozed off. On the fourth day, I found something else. I had just crossed a small ridge and was working my way down a slope covered in loose stone and scrub when I noticed an old trail. It wasn't on my map and it was barely visible, but it was there. A faint indentation in the ground, overgrown with weeds but straight enough to suggest it had been used at one time. It ran parallel to a shallow ravine and disappeared into the thick brush ahead. I followed it. The trail didn't seem natural. I've seen old logging roads and animal trails, but this wasn't quite like either. The ground was uneven, but in some places, it looked as though it had been intentionally flattened. Fallen logs had been dragged aside. There were faint grooves in the dirt, like maybe a cart or sled had once been pulled along it. I don't know, it just didn't feel right. I followed it for about 2 hours. That's when I found the clearing. It was maybe 60 yards wide, shaped like a rough oval, with grass growing in uneven patches and a few charred tree stumps at the edges. In the center was a collapsed wooden structure, what looked like the remains of a small cabin or shed. The roof had caved in, and most of the walls had rotted into black slats, but I could still make out the shape. It had once been square, maybe 10 by 10 feet. Next to it was an old metal stove, half buried in the earth, rusted solid. I should have turned around. I know that now, but I didn't. I was too curious. I stepped into the clearing. The ground felt soft, almost too soft, like it had been dug up and resettled. There were holes here and there, shallow pits mostly filled with dirt and leaves, but some looked like they'd been recently disturbed, like something had been buried and then dug up again. The air smelled musty, like wet newspaper. I poked around the ruins of the cabin. Most of it had collapsed into itself, but I spotted the corner of a wooden box near the stove. I brushed off the dirt and pulled it out. It was a tool chest, empty except for a few rusted nails and a broken hacksaw blade. Behind the cabin, I found something else. An old shovel sticking out of the ground, the handle splintered but the blade still sharp. Next to it was one of those shallow pits, maybe 2 feet deep. There was something inside it. Tarp. I stepped back. Something about it made my stomach clench. I didn't look under the tarp. I didn't want to know what was under there. I left. I didn't set up camp that night. I walked until dark, then kept walking with my headlamp on. I didn't stop until nearly 2 in the morning, when I finally found a flat stretch beside a dried-up creek and collapsed from exhaustion. I was 6 miles off my planned path. I knew that because my map didn't match the terrain anymore. The slope of the ridgeline was wrong. The direction of the creek was wrong. Even the trees looked different, thinner, more spaced out, and pale in color, almost as if they were dying. The next morning, I tried to backtrack, but something was wrong with my compass. It spun slowly in circles, never settling. I thought maybe I'd hit a pocket of magnetite in the rocks, so I walked a mile south, then tried again. Same result. By mid-afternoon, I admitted I was lost. I told myself I'd been in worse spots before. I rationed my food, filled my bottles from a spring I filtered, and marked every tree I passed with my knife so I wouldn't circle back. But no matter how far I walked, I never seemed to leave the same stretch of forest. The landscape kept repeating. Same clusters of trees, same moss patterns, same stumps. On the 6th day, I found my own footprints. That broke me a little. I recognized the boot print instantly. My right sole has a small crack near the toe that leaves a distinct mark. I followed the prints until they disappeared into brush, then reappeared again half a mile later. I hadn't made a circle. The print was several days old, crusted over with dried mud. I was moving in spirals, trapped in some kind of natural maze. On the 7th day, I heard something. Not an animal, not wind. It was the sound of something heavy dragging through leaves, slow and steady, like a bag full of wet sand being pulled across dirt. It was distant at first, but I froze instantly. I crouched behind a log, heart pounding. The sound came closer, then stopped, then started again. It circled me without ever getting. I don't know if it was stupidity or stubbornness that got me into it, but I'd been planning that backpacking trip for months, and nothing was going to stop me. I'd been through breakups, layoffs, and even a nasty flu over the winter, and the idea of getting away into the woods was the only thing that kept me going. I had my gear packed weeks before the actual date, route mapped on my phone and printed as a backup, emergency contacts lined up, and enough freeze-dried meals to last twice the planned trip. I was ready. The place I picked was upstate, a big stretch of national forest that people didn't talk much about. It wasn't famous like the Adirondacks or the Catskills. It was one of those quiet, wide places that didn't have many trailheads or maintained paths. That's what attracted me. I didn't want popular campsites or the sound of someone else's music 2 clearings over. I wanted real wilderness, the kind where you don't see another person for days. I wanted to feel that silence press in around me. I parked my car at the end of an old logging road, one of those dead-end trails that just stops in a tangle of brush and gravel. It took me a half hour just to turn around and find a place to wedge the car off the road so it wouldn't be in anyone's way. Not that I expected anyone else to come down that far. I locked up, hoisted my pack, and headed into the woods. The plan was to follow a ridgeline for a few miles until it dipped into a valley with a creek, then loop back around a different way. I figured I'd be out 3 nights. I had GPS, compass, and a backup paper map. I wasn't new to this. The first day went smooth. The air was cool and damp. The forest floor was soft underfoot, layers of pine needles and wet leaves. The ridge offered a view of endless green rolling hills, and I hiked steadily for 6 or 7 hours before stopping to make camp near a rocky outcrop. It was quiet. No bugs, no wind, not even birds that evening. That should have struck me as odd, but I chalked it up to the time of year. Spring was just starting to wake up the woods. That night was fine. I made some food, jotted down a few notes in a journal, then climbed into my sleeping bag and passed out to the sound of my own breath and the occasional distant rustle in the trees. Nothing unusual. The second day is where it started to shift. I woke up early, packed up, and followed the ridge east. About an hour in, I saw something that caught my eye, what looked like an old fence post, maybe 5 feet tall, poking out of the underbrush. It was gray and cracked, like it had been there forever. There was a second one a few feet away and a third beyond that. It wasn't a complete fence, just scattered remains of one that used to be there. I found that strange, given how deep into the woods I was. Maybe there'd been a homestead out here decades ago. People used to carve out farms in the middle of nowhere. I moved on, but about another mile in, I found a rusted piece of sheet metal half buried in the dirt, like the corner of an old shed. Then an enamel basin. Then what looked like a chunk of rotted mattress stuffing, half moss-covered. These weren't just random objects lost to time. This was a collapsed structure of some kind. I circled it for a bit, brushing away pine needles, but there wasn't much to find. Just the idea that someone had once lived out here and then disappeared. It left a weird taste in my mouth. That lonely kind of feeling, like you'd stumbled into a place you weren't supposed to see. I kept moving, putting in more miles than the first day. The plan was to reach the valley by late afternoon, but the trail started getting tricky. The undergrowth thickened and the elevation dropped sharply. I had to slow down, climbing over fallen logs and picking my way through thorny brush. I was still following the ridge, but it had started to twist, and I didn't recognize the land anymore. My GPS showed me where I was, but the path I had plotted didn't quite match the contours on the map. I thought maybe I'd veered too far north. Still, I pressed on. I knew the creek ran at the bottom of the valley and figured if I just kept descending, I'd run into it. Then I could follow it downstream until I hit the fork I'd planned to cross at. But I never found the creek. The deeper I went, the more tangled the woods became. The trees grew denser, closer together, and there were no signs of animal paths or game trails. The ground turned soft, almost marshy in spots, and the air took on this thick, sour smell, like mold and decay, but older. I started to notice how quiet it was again. No birds, no wind, no movement. By late afternoon, I realized I was off track. My GPS battery was dropping fast, too fast. I checked it and found it stuck on a loading screen when I tried to pull up the topographic map. That had never happened before. I rebooted it, but it froze again. I took out my compass, which was thankfully still working, and decided to backtrack west until I could find the ridge again. But going back wasn't as easy as I thought. Everything looked the same. I tried to follow my own footprints, but the ground was soft enough that they'd already started fading. I must have taken a wrong turn, because after an hour of steady hiking, the land dropped again, and I ended up in a hollow I didn't recognize. It was darker down there, and colder. The trees were older, with thick trunks and bare roots that twisted above the soil like veins. I made camp there, mostly because I didn't want to keep moving in circles and end up lost in the dark. I set up my tent, boiled water for a quick meal, and sat there for a long time with my headlamp off, trying to listen. There was no sound except for the occasional creak of a tree swaying. Felt wrong. Not dangerous, just wrong. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept waking up, certain I'd heard something move outside the tent. At one point, I sat up and just stared at the fabric, waiting for a shadow or a noise. There was nothing, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was nearby. Not watching, just present. In the morning, everything was covered in dew. I checked the GPS again. Still frozen. My phone had zero signal and was draining battery fast just sitting idle, so I shut it off to save it in case I needed it later. I ate a cold bar for breakfast and decided to try climbing back up the ridge instead of following the hollow. It was a tough climb. The terrain was steep and muddy, and I had to drop my pack more than once to scramble up the slope. I lost track of how long I was at it, but it was easily half the day before I crested a rise that looked vaguely familiar. I thought maybe it was the outcrop I camped near the first night, but when I got to the top, it was just a cliffside, sharp drop, no real view, just thick trees below. Then I saw the ladder. It was leaning against a tree about 30 feet from the cliff's edge. Old wood, rotting, maybe 10 rungs, some broken. It led up to nowhere, just a low branch. There was no tree stand, no platform, just the ladder. I didn't understand why it was there. It wasn't new, but it wasn't ancient either. 10, maybe 15 years old. The wood was warped, but not decayed. I didn't touch it, just stared at it a while, trying to make sense of it. Who'd build a ladder in the middle of nowhere to nowhere? I moved on, not sure what else to do. I was tired, legs sore, starting to get blisters from wet boots. My map didn't make sense anymore, and the sun had gone behind clouds, making it hard to orient by light. I started marking trees as I passed them, little scratches with my knife so I wouldn't loop around again. That night, I camped on a slope, not even bothering with a fire. I was too exhausted. I ate half a protein bar and laid there with my eyes open for hours, staring at the inside of my tent. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was this deep, gnawing anxiety that something was just fundamentally wrong with the woods. Not supernatural, not cursed, just off in a way that I couldn't explain. The next morning, I woke up to find one of my marked trees right outside the tent. It was one of the ones I'd cut a horizontal line into. I knew it was mine. Same shape, same bark pattern, same moss, which meant I'd either set up camp right where I'd passed through earlier, or something had moved the tree. That thought broke something in me. I packed in 10 minutes flat and started hiking downhill. I didn't care about my planned route or the creek or the ridgeline anymore. I just wanted out. I figured if I went downhill long enough, I'd eventually hit a road or a river or something. I rationed water, ate on the move, and kept my compass locked west. After hours of scrambling down loose soil and pushing through brush, I started to see signs of old logging activity. Ruts in the dirt, rusted cans, a strip of tarp tangled in a branch. It gave me hope. I pushed harder. My legs were shaking. I was dehydrated, dizzy, but I kept going. Late in the afternoon, I came over a rise and saw gravel. It was a service road, barely wide enough for a truck, but it was real and flat and cut through the trees in a straight line. I followed it until I found a clearing with a logging shack. Doors rusted off the hinges but dry inside. I collapsed there and slept like a corpse. The next day, I followed the road until it met a paved road. Flagged down a guy in a utility truck who gave me a ride back to the main road. Then I hitchhiked back to my car. Took me 2 full days to stop shaking. When I checked the GPS back home, it had no record of my route. Just a single point where I started, and then it froze, like I'd never moved. I don't usually go into the woods without a plan. For most of my adult life, I've been pretty careful about how I spend time in the backcountry. I'm not the reckless type who grabs a backpack and heads off without checking maps or packing right. But that weekend was different. I was burned out. Everything in my life felt too loud, too fast. I needed to get away from all of it. I picked a spot I hadn't hiked before, northwestern Maine, somewhere near the border. I'd found it mentioned in an old hunting forum. The area was described as remote, underused, and crisscrossed with abandoned cut lines from timber operations that had shut down decades ago. No campgrounds, no trails. That was the appeal. The map I brought was old, printed in the early 90s, but it was the only one I could find that showed the faded network of cut lines and logging roads. It wasn't perfect, but I figured I'd be able to navigate with my compass and GPS backup. I planned for a 2-day solo trip, hike out a few miles, pitch a tarp shelter, sleep in the wild, and hike back the next morning. I didn't even bring my tent, just the tarp, rope, a sleeping pad, and my bivy sack. I wanted to go light and fast, and I wasn't expecting rain. It was early October. The air was crisp and dry. Bugs were gone, and the forest was quieting down for winter. I parked my truck off a logging road near an unmarked service trail and started walking around 9 a.m. It was cold, probably low 40s, but I was sweating through my base layer in less than an hour. The woods were thick with spruce and pine, with an underlayer of moss and deadfall that made hiking slow. The old cut lines were hard to follow. Some were nothing more than faint lines in the ground where trees had grown back, and others were overgrown with brush and saplings. Still, I made steady progress. I'd marked a spot roughly 6 miles in where 2 old cut lines intersected, thinking it might give me enough visibility to camp safely. I figured I'd get there by mid-afternoon. By 3:30, I was near the location. I'd gone maybe 5.5 miles, and the terrain was getting rougher. I was climbing shallow ridges and dropping into tight, dark valleys filled with tangled brush. I'd seen moose tracks, fresh droppings, and what I thought were bear scat, but no people, no boot prints, nothing human. I found the intersection, barely recognizable as a junction anymore, just a narrow clearing stretching in 2 directions like faded scars. I dropped my pack, scouted around, then cleared a spot under a spruce stand on a slight rise. I set up my tarp between 2 trees using paracord, staked the corners, and rolled out my bivy sack underneath. I gathered some firewood, dug a shallow pit, and had a small fire going by dusk. I cooked a freeze-dried meal with my camp stove, sipped water from my Nalgene, and watched the fire die down. By the time the sky was completely dark, the temperature had dropped sharply. The woods were utterly still. No wind, no birds, not even owls. I remember lying in my bivy sack, staring up at the dim outline of trees against the night sky, listening to nothing. It was peaceful, but also a little unnerving. I didn't hear a single plane overhead, not even far off in the distance. No road noise, no wind in the trees. Felt like I was sealed inside some enormous, dark vacuum. I remember thinking it was perfect. I finally felt unplugged from everything. I must have fallen asleep around 10. I didn't check my watch. It was the kind of sleep that comes from physical exhaustion, not comfort. But sometime deep in the night, I woke up with a start. My body was stiff, and the air had gotten much colder. I couldn't see much except a bit of moonlight filtering through the tarp above. My ears were ringing slightly, and I couldn't figure out why I was awake. I didn't hear any animal sounds. No twigs snapping, just the ringing. I stayed still for a few minutes, eyes wide open, waiting for something, anything. But nothing happened, just the stillness. Eventually I rolled onto my side, tucked deeper into my bivvy, and tried to drift off again. I must have managed to sleep a few more hours, but I never really felt fully out. It was one of those half-sleep states where your brain stays on a low simmer. When I woke again, the light was dull blue, early morning. Frost covered the ground and my pack. I stood up, stretched, then relieved myself a few steps into the woods. I made some instant coffee over the stove and chewed on a protein bar while warming my hands. I figured I'd break camp and head back to the truck by late morning. That was the plan. But when I packed up and pulled out my map and compass, something didn't feel right. I couldn't find the cut line I'd followed in on. It was supposed to head southwest from the clearing, but I walked in 3 circles and couldn't locate it. Everything looked the same, thick, cold woods with no trail. I checked the GPS, but it wouldn't lock onto satellites. The signal was bouncing in and out. The forest was too dense, and the old receiver wasn't doing the job. I wasn't panicked yet. I had my compass and a decent idea of my bearings. I knew if I walked due southwest, I'd eventually cross the logging road I'd driven in on. But after an hour of hiking through thick brush, I still hadn't found it. I checked the map again, trying to match the land contours, but nothing was lining up the way it should have. The ridges were too close together or too far apart. There was a swampy lowland that wasn't marked. I started to get that sinking feeling you get when you know you're not where you think you are. By noon, I'd walked for almost 3 hours and hadn't seen a single recognizable landmark. Everything was wrong. I'd find what looked like a game trail, follow it, only for it to vanish. My compass still pointed in the right direction, but the forest wasn't changing. It was as if I was walking in place. At one point, I climbed a steep hill to get a better view, thinking I'd see a break in the trees, but there was nothing, just more forest in every direction. I rested for 15 minutes and ate another protein bar. My water bottle was half empty. I was sweating under my jacket, but the air was cold. I kept moving, slower now, trying not to get too frustrated. But something shifted around mid-afternoon. I noticed a broken tree stump, a big, rotting cedar. I passed it before, no doubt, the exact same one. Same jagged split, same moss pattern. That's when I realized I'd somehow doubled back, even though my compass still pointed southwest. That was the first time I felt real fear. I told myself to stay calm, that I just looped accidentally, and that I could correct course. But after another hour, I came across the remains of my fire pit. Same spot, same damn clearing. I stood there for a long time, not moving. My heart was pounding in my ears. I'd been walking all day in what I thought was a straight line, and I'd ended up right back where I started. It didn't make sense. The terrain hadn't looked familiar, but now I was here again, and it was unmistakable. I walked to the tree where I'd hung my food bag overnight and found the broken branch I'd stepped on. It was all still there, my footprint in the mud near the base of the spruce. I wasn't just lost. I was stuck, somehow circling the same patch of woods without even realizing it. I didn't stay there long. I forced myself to pick a new bearing, due west this time, and started walking. I didn't stop. I didn't even rest. I just powered through the forest with a growing sense of desperation. I slipped on roots, scraped my legs on low branches, and nearly twisted my ankle in a hole filled with dead leaves. The sun started dropping behind the hills again, and I still hadn't found a road or a trail. I was miles from anywhere in unfamiliar woods, with only a quarter bottle of water left and 1 protein bar. As darkness fell, I made a quick camp without setting up a tarp. Just laid my bivvy down and crawled inside. I didn't eat. I didn't sleep. I lay there all night, eyes open, listening to the woods creak and shift around me. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, not animal sounds, steps, crunching slowly through the underbrush. But when I sat up and listened hard, it was gone. Maybe it was just my ears playing tricks on me. Maybe not. The next day was more of the same. I hiked for hours, picked another direction, and tried to stay focused. My compass was useless now. Every landmark felt like something I'd seen already. I found the same broken stump again, the same rock outcrop. I was trapped in some natural maze, and I couldn't figure out how. It went on for 2 more days. By then, I'd run out of food, and my water filter had clogged. I drank from a stream and hoped for the best. My legs were shaking constantly. I was barely sleeping, just resting under trees, wrapped in my sleeping bag, trying to conserve heat. On the 5th morning, I woke to the sound of an engine. Faint, distant, but real. I didn't think. I just ran. I left my bivvy and tarp behind, crashing through brush in the direction of the sound. I fell twice. Once I slammed my knee into a rock so hard I screamed, but I kept going. Eventually, I stumbled out onto a muddy, rutted path, a real road. I collapsed.